I've made my notes kind of like Nathan talked about. I'm happy to be like the talking doll that you pull the string and it goes for 2 hours straight. But I do enjoy when maybe there's something that you want to know about a particular subject or something I hit on you'd like us to go more in depth on. Just you can unmute yourself and ask, or if you want to use the chat feature, forgive me, I don't use Zoom much, so if I accidentally smiley face a very negative question, it was a total accident. But I want to, take advantage, walk through as much as I can, and then, probably toward the end, what I'd like to do is leave a little bit of open time. So if you do have some bigger questions or things like that you'd like me to speak to, that I can do that. And I'll also, if you're in the reading mindset, I'll have a series of books that I can suggest, if it's something you want to dig into a particular piece. And Joe Brand, you just got on. There's going to be a 100-question quiz at the end. I just want to make sure you're ready for that. Everybody else has the cheat sheet, but latecomers didn't get it. So.
Can I use my crayons?
Yes, please.
Thank you. It's so helpful.
All right. So it's important, and I think we see that not only in the biblical text, but in many other places, to study the history and the location, the place that where we're at. We see in the Old Testament the command to raise the stone at Ebenezer to mark something. We also see the lineage of Jesus, where it proves where he comes in the Davidic line. So there's evidence in the Bible that it's important to know who we are, where we came from, where we're at. It doesn't mean we need to live in the past. It doesn't mean to need to erase the past. It just means we need to know and acknowledge and be aware of it. Another example that made its way from England to New England and still exists in some places is something called beating the bounds. And that is an old English practice where once a year, usually led by the chief civic officials or the head of the parish, almost the entire community would come out and move as a group and physically walk the boundaries of the town or county or parish, so that it was ingrained in everyone's memory of, here's where our town is, we turn at this tree, we walk beside this creek, that's where this land is, that's where that land is. So that it was ingrained in each people's memory and psyche. We also see that in the Jewish tradition of the Seder meal. That first question that gets asked by the oldest or the youngest child that's capable is, why is this night different than any others? It's the reflection on, here is why we're doing what we do. If not, then if we're not continually remembering what we're doing, we're just slicing the ends off the ham to fit inside the proverbial pot roast. In sort of crafting a history of where we are, looking at Gwinnett County, hopefully, Sherry will give me a like and a thumbs up for saying this fancy word. Historiography is an important thing to keep in mind. And that lovely, boring term just means the study of history. And so when you look at that, the reason I bring it up is, regardless of how you present anything, you are selecting facts that you're going to present to a group. So know that going through this, I've tried to be as clear and concise and pull out some examples to talk to everybody and to kind of talk us through, the past several hundred years of this area. Yes, thank you, Sherry. But, there's going to be pieces I leave out, pieces that probably interest you I leave out, or maybe something I had in that you just thought took up too much time. And know that I'm trying to select and do the best we can, but there is a course and a study of that as we try to present it, that different sides come and go. To give you a little bit, just to know that I'm not just a common idiot talking. I do have some background. My BA is in history and anthropology. My master's is in history from Arkansas State. As far as when I look back at the stories that you'll hear me recollect or talk about or reflect on, the Stancel family moved to about a half mile from my house right now in the 1870s, and they were the last ones of my ancestors to get here. The bulk of them got here in the 1700s, and we're in this area ever since then. So you always want to, as Reagan would say, trust but verify. So a lot of times these family stories, and I'll give you a couple of those as we go through it, that maybe I raised my eyebrows as a kid or a teenager, and then I would stumble across facts later that proved, oh, wait, there was a version of that that was true. So you'll hear me reach back and talk about some of those things as well. Gwinnett County doesn't come into existence until 1818, so we're just a little over 200 years old. But the land itself where we sit has been a place of constant conflict. Probably the earliest written record we have of that comes from the 1600s when Hernando de Soto crossed somewhere near the area. We can't say he came exactly through Lawrenceville or Lilburn or Beaufort or any of those places, but we know he was somewhere close to here because some of the names, and he had three different people in his party who kept journals. One of them a priest, and then a couple of other lesser noblemen that kept records as they traveled out of Florida up through near where Asheville is, down into this area, and then across toward Alabama and back down to the Gulf Coast. They kept records of town names, things like that. And the reason we're able to associate that he came near here is because the Native American names for certain areas were the same names that the English would record when they came later in. So we know that that was probably your first European contact in the area, 1600s. And that contact would have been what was called the Mississippian culture. It was starting to pass kind of to the Muskogee Creek, but at that time, mound building, things like that. So if you've seen the Etowah Indian mounds, the Ocmulgee Indian mounds, the people that created those places would have been the Native Americans that would have populated this area. Part of the reason that this area would have been so useful is because of the geography.
I think you got muted, Eli. There you go. Oh, no, muted. There you go.
Okay. I think I'm good now. All right. So I'm going to start back over around the Mississippian period. Give me a thumbs up if you heard that. Okay. So anyway, if you're familiar with the Ocmulgee, Etowah Indian mounds, that same culture would have been present in this area. The Chattahoochee River to the north of us, that's a major drainage. The first ridge south of that is the Eastern Continental Divide. And what's unique about the Eastern Continental Divide is everything that goes to the Chattahoochee makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico. Everything on the south side of that divide goes to the Atlantic Ocean. That means no creek ever crosses that ridge. It makes for a natural trail. So for centuries and centuries, that was a main thoroughfare. Rivers have always been a way to move, and dugout canoes, things like that would have been in constant use by native peoples to move up and down rivers. But if they were going to go on foot overland, that would have been one of the major pathways, was through this area. So it would have been a constant move of conflict, not conflict, but a constant changing of cultures. That's probably the reason that De Soto came this way, is he would have been able to come there and continue overland marching along the ridgetop without having to cross any creeks in his path. By the time that the Revolution is getting close and kind of the close of the English colonial era, the area where Gwinnett is would have been Muskogee Creek Indian country. So the Mississippians kind of birth out a couple of different groups, and Muskogee Creeks are one of those. They would have populated as far north as kind of Franklin County and those areas. But the Iroquois, following the Great War Path, or the Great Trading Path between, had a branch of their Native American groups that moved in and started pushing out the southern native tribes. And the branch that came down was called the Cherokee. So the Cherokee actually are only a couple hundred years older than European, established areas here. And they begin pushing the Creeks out of the area of Gwinnett County. So conflict is starting to happen here within the native cultures far before the Europeans can make it worse. And they just sort of highlight it and make it even worse as it goes along, and then play the sides against each other. When Georgia is first founded, a lot of the complaints along the frontier are that, hey, you know, we're the lower creeks, or we're the creeks from what we call the upper creeks or the Red Stick Creeks. And we've made this agreement with the state of Georgia, with the United States government, or with this farmer about trading. And now the Cherokees are hunting on our land. You need to go over there and talk to them about doing something. And so there's this constant move, and they're moving up along that same ridge line. Some of you have probably heard me rail about some of the town names around here. One of the things that Gwinnett County Schools has done right is to name a high school Peachtree Ridge. That would have been one of the first names for that high ground that moves through there. They called it Peachtree Ridge from the earliest English records. And so kudos there. That was a good choice. Let's see. So now you get to see if I can pull this off by sharing part of my screen. And do I have that option? Or do you have to hit the magic button for me? Oh, there it is. Share screen. Yeah, let's see. Let's go right in here. And I want to show you this map. Okay, y'all are all on my side. Nathan, I can see you clearly. Give me a thumbs up if you can see an old map there. All right. So this is an 1813 map of what is known as Georgia at the time. So we've just, come out of
The map
the
is.
Do what?
I gave you a thumbs up because I saw your screen. I didn't wait till you said if I saw the map.
Okay.
So maybe minimize the window that's there to see if the map's up.
Okay. Let's see. You see anything now?
No, sir.
All right. Let's see. Let's go back to trying something. There's that. Stop share. Forgive my ignorance on this thing. I am going to make this happen one way or the other.
Hey, Eli, are you working off of one or two screens?
One screen.
Okay. When you go to share, can you share your whole desktop and then pull up the file?
I got you. Let's see if that works.
Yep, there it
You can see
is.
All right. Outstanding. Good. So here's your 1813 map of Georgia. Hopefully you can see my cursor kind of move across. And some of the names you'll recognize: Watkinsville, Carnesville is in Franklin's County. Tugelo is just outside of Toccoa, Georgia. This was the crossing over the Savannah River, or the Tugelo River in that area. This stream right through here, Chuta, is the Chattahoochee. And you'll notice there's some marked fords where you could cross over it. In this area, this would have been where the Cherokee was starting to push the creeks out. The creeks would have been in this area and all down through here. The unique part about the growth of Georgia and the area is that the English moved in from South Carolina and would have come across mainly at these river crossings and would have come up these rivers. So places that are, just kind of down off the map would have been where the progression of their move into the state would have come. They would have moved up these rivers using those as passageways, and that would have been the first touches into Gwinnett County, as well as coming in from what's called the South Carolina upcountry down the series of high ridges to get here and settle. And it's not until 1790 that we get a good solid definition of here is the outline of the state of Georgia. And what happens in 1790 is George Washington invites, all the Native American chiefs to New York, and they draw out solid lines to say, here's the boundaries. Here's where we're going to say the United States exists. Here's where your lands exist. And we'll stop growing from there. We'll never come encroaching your territory after that. And you can see how well that worked out. Now, the advantage to, come on now, share screen, to some of that stuff is we can go back and take a good look at how it looks currently, thanks to our lovely tax assessor. Now, it's very important that we all pay our taxes and pay the appropriate amount, so you need to know how much land you have. So Gwinnett County has mapped out every square inch of our land, and of course charges us based on how it's zoned. If you can kind of see this area my mouse is going, you can see Interstate 85 moves along, and here's 985. And you'll see all these little squares with 7-135 or 7-179. Those are land lots. Very nice and square, but you'll notice there's big jumbled mess over on the right-hand side of the screen. This is that Treaty of New York. When they decided here's what the boundary of Georgia is going to be coming out of the Revolution, they drew a line from the top of Currahee Mountain to the headwaters of the Appalachian River and said everything on this side is going to be United States, everything over here is going to be Native American land. And right about here where these corners meet is where the headwaters of the Appalachian are. If you're familiar with where the Georgia Gun Club is, or where Old Peachtree Road crosses Highway 124 or Brownston Highway, that about was the absolute corner of the United States in 1790. So that's where the earliest portions of Gwinnett would have been inhabited by Europeans legally. Now, there were a lot of people that started jumping over, let me go ahead and admit, a lot of people started jumping over these lines and settling. One of the most notable is a guy named Benjamin Ivy, and he settled along a creek that he later called Beaver Run. And of course, the slang at the time took run for creek, and it became ruin. And so if you're familiar with the Beaver Ruin exit, that's where one of these early landhoppers moved down, settled on the banks of a creek, and his cabins were still there into the early 1900s. But one of the things to emphasize again is this crooked little boundary down through here is the Appalachian River. These rivers are the main means of egress and ingress, movement, trading of goods, any of that type of stuff at this time. That's how people are going back and forth. That's how we're moving things. That's how we're drawing boundaries and such. This is kind of what stays the same until around 1812, 1813, 1814. So for a couple of decades, this is the corner of the United States. And in 1812, there's the War of 1812. Where that affects Georgia is that the British are fighting some guy named Napoleon. The best way to attack your enemy is to use your enemy's enemies. So they come over here to the Creek Nation and they say, look, we've got ammunition, we've got guns, we've got all these supplies. We just don't have a lot of men to send over there. Would you mind going after all the Americans that are giving us trouble? And, they're happy to oblige. The Creek Nation has split into an upper and lower portion. The lower portion would have been lower Georgia below Macon. And they were trying to take on European agriculture, trade in European ways. The upper creeks held to a very traditional living standard, and they tried to ally themselves with Tecumseh. If you're familiar with that name, he came through the area, and the Red Stick Creeks thought his idea for a pan-Indian alliance to resist the encroachment of the United States was probably the best thing to do. So as such, they ally, and the battles end up happening further down the line over in the border of Georgia and Alabama. But they make a statement which makes its way into local print that says, I'm going to ravage, we're going to take our troops, we're going to ravage all the way across Georgia Company up through and including the Hog Mountain. And that would have been this area right here, essentially right where we're at, the area known as Hog Mountain. And so in response to that, the governor of Georgia builds a series of forts along the borders, all up and down the Appalachia. And then one right here at this furthest west corner, and that's Fort Daniel. So if you've ever seen any of my posts on that, that comes out of this time period, at a time when it thought that the Red Stick Creeks may actually invade the area. After tracing down one of the rumored attacks of 400 to 600 Indians getting close to and attacking the Hog Mountain, and we took that back, started looking at more of the newspaper accounts. It turns out being that it was 4 intoxicated Creek Indians demanding salt and whiskey from a store owner in the Hog Mountain area. But by the time that that story got to Jefferson, and that story got to Augusta, and it got to Savannah. The number of Indians and their intention grew bigger and bigger and bigger, until by the time it was published in Baltimore a couple of months later, it was several hundred Indians were ravaging the countryside. So that was, you know, something blown a bit out of hand that didn't really happen there. A little bit further down on that map, I'm going to share one little piece again, just so you can kind of see the entire screen. I want to point out Barrow County doesn't get created until 1920. And so each one of these little corners kind of tells a tale about the border of the county. But this little corner right here, where Barrow comes down and touches the Appalachian River and goes down, was the site of an old mill called Hill's Mill. And this was one of those family stories that got passed along, and I'm like, yeah, that didn't really happen. And then I had to eat a little bit of crow. There was rumor that there had been an Indian skirmish there during the War of 1812, and they thought the Creeks were going to rise up, and gunshots and hatchets and everything happened. And, you know, we all got those stories in our family, right? So Eli just kind of nods his head and smiles and moves along. Until a couple years ago, we went and researched, and when they drew out those land lots in 1820, the adjoining land lot across the river showed a marker at that very corner for Hill's Mill. So it proved the mill was there. Then one of the veterans in their pension statement talked about their service during the War of 1812. A guy named John Epperson, he said, I fought here and I enlisted there, and I was involved in the Indian battle at Hill's Mill on the Appalachian River. So I had to go back and say, well, apparently there was something that happened there. So again, Gwinnett, a place of conflict. It hasn't stopped. It won't ever stop. What comes after the War of 1812 is what really expands and creates the county. So we had that little corner that came down a very small portion, what's eastern, northeastern Gwinnett County. When the Red Stick Creeks were defeated as a smaller part of that War of 1812, they signed over millions of acres to the United States government. And so surveyors were sent out, drew lots off. Some new counties were created in Georgia as a result of that. Hall County named for Lyman Hall, Gwinnett County named for Button Gwinnett, and Walton County named for George Walton, your signers of the Declaration of Independence. And they drew off all those little squares. And then what happened was, if you're a freed man in the state of Georgia, you get one draw in that land lottery in any of those counties. So your name goes in the hat. If you served in any of the previous wars, 1812 Revolution, you get another draw that goes into the hat. If you're the widow of one of those soldiers, you get another draw that goes into the hat. If you're the minor children, you get a draw that goes into the hat. And so they put all the names in there, root around, pull the name out, and that's how we go about handing out who gets this land. I have to go back and show you. Sorry, I'm a map guy. But if you're curious and you decide to go to the Gwinnett County GIS site, you can go and say, let me zoom in and pick out any particular place that you live. So you see there's Buford Highway, and let's say I live in this subdivision right here, lot number 7-91. You can go look at the land lottery records, and you can see that was drew by a guy named Young. He moved up from Greene County and began farming on that land, cleared it out, and then was able to eventually sell it off. Now, just to think about how land use has changed and developed, that whole square right there was given to one person of that lottery draw. Look at how many houses now exist on that one square. So it has, obviously we've changed our land use and our processes over time, but going back to when the county was first created, that's how we handed things out, was we went through there, drew that stuff off. This is actually, it is a unique picture into a sort of early equality, because there were some African-American soldiers from the Revolution who drew land, not in Gwinnett, but you drew land in these lotteries were actually able to go off use specie to pay for the initial taxes, which is what you're required to do. And then you could possess the land. So that becomes some of our first African-American landholders in the state was during this time period because of their prior war service with the United States. When you won one of those lottery drawings, you got the land, but you had to pay an initial tax and a small processing fee. You know, we can't let the government get by without charging us a processing fee. But this was one of the times that processing fee actually went to good work. That processing fee went into a pot, sort of a sinking fund, if you will. And if the widows or some of the orphan children of war veterans drew one of those lots, their tax money got pulled out of that pot to pay for the first year of the taxes on that land. So that if they were lucky enough to get the draw, they would be able to maintain the land in that first year at least. And that would give them a year to either sell it, have an agent sell it for them, or do something like that with it. A lot of times these former soldiers didn't have the required specie or hard currency to pay for this land. And so sometimes if they did win it, they would sell it off at a very reduced price in order to get that handed off. Okay, I think make this full, let's see, okay. I got your message there, Joe. Now I've got to figure out how to close that. All right, I will do my best. The draw was definitely like winning a lottery. Not everyone got land. Everybody got their name in the hat if you were a free person, or you got additional draws to get your name pulled out if you had served or had been injured in the war or something like that. But not everybody got their name in the hat. That's the way of the time. That's how that got handed out. Okay, let's see. So one of the other small things I might mention about that time period was this store that was at Hog Mountain that was raided by the intoxicated Creeks. The guy that ran it was a guy named William Kidd, who apparently was a very courageous war veteran, but pretty much a bully and a debtor. And every time he would move to a place, he'd run up his tab real high. And then once the authorities closed in on him, he'd move out to the next town. That's why he was out here on the edge of the frontier. Once it got too hot for him here, after that incident and some other things that went on, he split and moved down to what would become DeKalb County and sold the place off to a guy named Maltby, who was from Connecticut, who had moved down to take advantage of the new lands. Maltby ends up getting involved in marrying the daughter of a guy named Elijah Wynn. Elijah Wynn, if you're familiar with the house or have seen it, that house was built on what would have been the United States side of the Appalachian River in 1790. And when the county is organized, you saw what a small little slice of the county had actually been inhabited by Europeans before. So they made Elijah Wynn's home and barn the first county offices. So when they had their first elections, had their first sheriff's sales for indebtedness, had their first court, the first court was actually held in a barn in his backyard because it was the only structure large enough to be able to get everybody into kind of one big space. So they moved all the mules and horses out and moved all the people in. And, whether it stank as bad or not, that's a decision you'll have to make on your own. But that was where the first court was held, because that was one of the first buildings or one of the only buildings that was standing in the area that was Gwinnett County. If you look, Lawrenceville is then built, or a series of those squares, those lottery squares, are held in reserve. They're not allowed to be drawn because they're the geographic center of the county. And though it looks a little off-center now, if you go back to before Barrow County is created and before part of DeKalb gets lopped off, Lawrenceville is the dead center geographically of the county. And so they use that area. They say nobody can draw these squares because that's where the county seat's going to be. That's where the county school is going to be at, and all that sort of stuff. You've probably noticed, as you're in Lawrenceville, it doesn't necessarily look like the best fit. The courthouse is sitting a little bit down. You'd think that'd be on the highest point. It's not necessarily. The railroad's on the other side. The springs aren't necessarily really close to the center of town. Well, that's because it's just built geographically. They just said, okay, X marks the spot. Now go put a building there. And that's where the town grew up. It's not necessarily a great geographic place to build, or, a great as far as the land and topography goes, but it was the center for everybody. And so no matter what part of the county you'd be in, you could come the same distance to be able to come to court or do any of your business along those lines. Being as such, being it's not a geographic town, you don't have necessarily the same trade advantages that you would have, say, in a place like Suwanee, which is Old Town Suwanee was right down on the actual Chattahoochee River. You know, very easy to move heavy goods in and out of a place like that. Or if you go to the other side, anywhere along the Appalachia River, where you can use water and move things up and down or get mill power, things of those natures. Lawrenceville develops as a political town from its start. That's what will always be the driver in that city, because it's not built at necessarily a crossroads of commerce. Commerce comes to the city, as a matter of fact, afterwards. It gets established to be the political center of the county. The street names of Lawrenceville harken back to the time of its creation. Croghan, you know, Lawrence itself, it's named for James Lawrence, War of 1812 guy. Same for Croghan, Pike, all those streets around. They're all 1812 time period people. So you name it for recent famous people when you're building the city. That's what all those names around the square indicate. So as we move in, let me get my next beautiful little map up here to bore you with. But I think this tells a really unique story about who we are. Let's see, 1830 Georgia. So if we make our way kind of the 1830s, let's see if that will render a little bit nicely. You can see we've now, I know it's a little fuzzy, it's about the best rendering I can get, but you see this whole Cherokee Indian land up here. And everything else below is now become part of the state of Georgia. We've pushed all the Creek Indians to the west. The Trail of Tears has not happened yet. The Cherokees had been on the losing side in the Revolution in most cases. They've swung back, have tried to ally themselves with the United States and to play by modern European farming, interaction, communication rules. You know, you probably learned about the Cherokee alphabet and you heard about the Cherokee Phoenix and things like that. Well, Vans Ferry is one of the big crossings into Cherokee country. That's modern day Flowery Branch. Another place that was easy to cross into Cherokee country was in a place where the rocks of the Chattahoochee went flat. So the Chattahoochee generally is moving pretty fast and fairly deep, where you can't move wagons and stuff like that over. But there is a place in Lower Gwinnett County where it spreads out and fans out across a series of a very flat shoal. And the nickname for it was the Shallow Ford. Now you'll see that echoed in the current name of the road, Shallowford Road. But that was where the shallow ford across the Chattahoochee was, where you could easily move goods back and forth across the river. You had to have a pass from the U.S. government blockhouses or from the U.S. government agent, a little passport to pass the port of entry into Cherokee Nation to do trading or something like that. In the 1830s, vigilant Christian missionaries, just like everybody else on this call, were seeking out to convert these people. And there's a number of missionary stations. One, probably the most famous, was at the Hightower Station in the center of the Cherokee Nation. The most famous of the American Missionary Board senders at that time was a guy named Samuel Worcester. And he was from Vermont originally, felt convicted to serve in a missionary capacity, and so came down and helped the Cherokee take their alphabet and create the Phoenix. He helped secure the printing equipment to be able to put that newspaper out, to be able to bring them up. And his point was to be actively engaged with this group, to show them how to come into, not for the sake of European learning, but for the sake of showing them the Bible, and help write Cherokee hymns and things like that. A small problem sort of erupts while he's over there, because, how do I close that thing? Close. All right. Because right about this same time as he and 11 other folks from the American Missionary Board are working with the Cherokees, gold is discovered in Gwinnett County. If you're ever driving around Beaufort and see Richland Creek, it's named Richland because of the gold deposits along its bank. They find it there, and then in the same way that settlers jumped over the Appalachian River for land in the Creek territory, prospectors start jumping over the Chattahoochee River without a passport, without permission, and digging around on Cherokee land. And they find huge deposits of gold around Dahlonega, White County, all the way across. So now we need to get rid of the Cherokees because we need that to be white man's land so we can go out and get all this gold. The state of Georgia reacts by creating their own law that says you cannot be present on Cherokee land without a pass from the state of Georgia. This puts Samuel Worcester and his folks in a very tight spot because they're here very vividly with the vision to convert the Cherokees to Christianity. That's what they're there for. They don't see the state of Georgia as anybody they've got to report to because the Cherokees are a federally mandated tribe. Now, that's great. That's a really neat story, Eli. What in the devil does that have to do with Gwinnett County? So Georgia sends over essentially state marshals to apprehend these 12 missionaries because they've broken Georgia's law. They bring them back to the nearest state courthouse they can find to try them, and that's in Lawrenceville. So they bring them into Lawrenceville, and they try them and find them in violation of Georgia's laws, and then sentence them to 4 years of hard labor at Milledgeville, because that's where the state capital is at the time. Remember, everything's moving up and down these rivers. That's the way your roads and all the connections happen. Milledgeville is the state capital, so it makes sense to have everything funnel that way. So they're going to be sentenced. They get sentenced on a Saturday. And Worcester is probably the cleanest, the most well-spoken among them all. He's actually not a minister. He identifies as a doctor of divinity. But he doesn't identify, or professor of religion, I say, he doesn't identify as a minister. And he writes this letter that says, hey, I understand that you've convicted us, that you're going to send us to Milledgeville for hard labor. Tomorrow's the Sabbath. We are missionaries. We'd really like to not travel on the Sabbath. And the sheriff of Gwinnett County, who is charged with taking these people in Milledgeville, writes this really touching, heartfelt letter back to him. He says, this costs way too much money. It costs the taxpayers of this county a lot of money to keep you. There's 12 people. We're not set up to keep 12 people. But I want you to know that not everybody feels the same way that the state of Georgia does. We believe that you're doing a good work. We believe you're trying to do the right thing, and we're going to be happy to pay to keep you the extra day before we carry you down there. So he honors his request to allow them to stay and to kind of have their own internal worship on the Sabbath and then travel to Milledgeville on Monday so they don't have to travel on the Sabbath. So the reason I bring out that letter, this harkens to current events. We're missing if we're not. When you look at a broad picture, it's very easy to criminalize and to point fingers. When you go to a one-on-one conversation, it's a lot tougher. It involves, and I think a lot of times we peel back the layers of the onion and we see people's personal convictions and what they're doing to survive. And so you see in that exchange a very loving and touching, albeit tough and difficult time. The antidote, or not the antidote, but the antecedent that happens is that Worcester and them go to Milledgeville. The governor is a guy named Gilmer at the time. George Gilmer was a U.S. military officer who passed through Fort Daniel just 20 years before this conviction happened and helped build a little fort called Fort Peachtree in a town that's now known as Atlanta. He's familiar with the area. He meets with these 12 missionaries and says, look, if you'll just agree not to go back over there, we'll drop all the charges. There won't be any heavy labor. And 10 of them say yes. Worcester says, no, I'm not. You don't have authority to keep me out of the Cherokee Nation. Okay, fine. Worcester turns around and sues the state of Georgia. It goes to the Supreme Court. One justice short of a unanimous decision says Worcester is right. He has every right to be in the Cherokee Nation. He's there at the Cherokee's invitation. The relationships between the United States and dependent Indian nations is made at the federal level, not at the state level. Georgia, you must rescind all your convictions. We're going to vacate those. they completely exonerate him. And so that then layers over to his counterparts as well. Worcester comes back to Georgia, but the damage is already done. At this point, Andrew Jackson is in the presidency. All the wheels and cogs have been set in motion for the Trail of Tears to push the Native Americans out to Oklahoma. Worcester sees that writing on the wall. He knows they're not going to be able to beat him, because one of the things that comes out of Worcester versus Georgia is that the federal government's not supposed to be able to kick natives off the land. And it's a terrible paraphrase, but it's true in its sentiment. Andrew Jackson essentially said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And so the executive branch did not enforce the judicial decision and pushed the Cherokees off their land to Oklahoma. Worcester, as kind of the follow-up to his intervention, sees where they're going. He moves out to Oklahoma, goes ahead and sets up the new printing office, starts working on the Cherokee hymnal, and those sorts of things. And he and his wife live out the rest of their days missionaries to the Cherokee people. And they're buried there in Oklahoma territory. And so a little bit of a connection, Gwinnett County to major Supreme Court cases. Won't be the first time that we see them. I'm sure it won't be the last. Right after that happened, right as they're pushing everybody west, the Cherokees, they continue to be a people trying to follow the European pattern. The death toll is horrific as they move out to Oklahoma. Yes, I see your note. Just say I'll make sure I send links and stuff out here at the end. But the Creeks, they've experienced getting their land taken, and they have decided here it's 1836. They're trying to show us again we're not going to do it again, and they begin fighting against the U.S. pushing them out west. The Gwinnett County raises a troop of homegrown militia, and so they load up on their horses and they go to South Georgia and join the U.S. forces pushing the Creek Nation off the land, trying to force them to go to Oklahoma and join everybody else. A number of them are fighting almost like a running battle in a place called Shepherd's Plantation, Georgia. And as they are pursuing the Creeks, they keep drawing them deeper. And what they don't realize is the Creeks are playing a great strategy of sucking them into a place where they have people on each side and they can surprise and win. And that's what happens at Shepherd's Plantation. Is there's about, forgive me on the number, I want to say it's around 20, maybe 17 Gwinnett County citizens that are killed at this skirmish battle at a place called Shepherd's Plantation. Those people are seen as, residents of the county, somebody that should be brought back and taken care of, because, not all of them came from rich families. A number of them were just local farmers, whatever they were. So those bodies are all transported back to Gwinnett County, placed adjacent to the courthouse, buried and then marked with a big granite obelisk. So if you go and walk around the county courthouse today and you see where the gazebo is, the old courthouse, right beside it, there's a tall obelisk made of Georgia marble. It says in honor of the Shepherd Plantation, a militia, and here's those people. There's 17 to 20 Gwinnett Countyans buried right there on the courthouse grounds. Part of the legacy of Gwinnett County's kind of turbulent past. One of the things that comes out of all this that I think is hard for us in the present day to see and understand is how people viewed their communities and their places where they lived. If you're in 1830, 1840, 1850, and you come up and say, Eli, tell me about yourself. My name's Eli Stancel. I'm a citizen of Georgia. You saw yourself as a citizen of the state. If we go back even to the peace that comes after the Revolution, Great Britain doesn't recognize necessarily the United States of America. They recognize the state of Georgia, the state of New Jersey, the state of Pennsylvania, the colonies of these states. They see them kind of as loosely bound together. They don't necessarily recognize them as a unified force. And that's how people kind of identify. And if you examine these people that are living in Gwinnett County at the time of the 1830s, 1840s, they have just moved on to this land no sooner than 2 decades ago. The only way you survive is with your community. You know, if you're not relying on your neighbors, then if you're not relying on your neighbors, you're not going to make it. So people really bound themselves closely in this area. That lasts through, you know, you continue to see that until the Civil War. That's when we first start seeing more of the idea in the South, or in Gwinnett County even, of I'm a citizen of the United States and a resident of Georgia. Because you didn't have any choice but to rely on the people that were next door to you. There's one of the books that, if any of this time period interests you, or kind of how this sounds like, there's a Pulitzer Prize winning author from Georgia, and she wrote a book called Lamb in His Bosom, and it's based in the Wiregrass region of South Georgia, but it does a great job of painting what it was like to be a European person moving onto this land, trying to clear it into farm. The land would have been, you know, maybe dense undergrowth, but in most cases not. It would have been old growth timber, very few American chestnuts, mostly big oak trees, big poplar trees, things like that. And you would have had, you know, just massive trees that you would have to cut down. If you're unfortunate to get some of the swamp land, you were just kind of up a river. If you're fortunate to have something on a river line, you might would have had some chance to develop that. But in that book, Lamb in His Bosom, you get the feeling for how they're tied in so close to where they're at, because they make a trip once a year to town. That's it. Everything else has to happen on that farm, in that frontier, whether it's going out hunting or anything, be it medical care, any of that stuff. And it's not all that different here in Gwinnett. You know, you think about if you were on this land in 1840 and you needed to get to a doctor, the nearest one was probably over toward where Auburn, Georgia is. There would have been one that eventually started setting up practice in Lawrenceville by that time. But before then, everything else is going to be at least a day or two horse ride away. You didn't need to waste that time. That time needed to be handled on clearing your homestead or farming and that type of stuff. So it was very intricate that you associate with each other and the community around you. So that's the big key and kind of how this place develops at the time. Moving into the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, you know, this is the period that's the buildup to the Civil War. Gwinnett County this is another point where it becomes kind of a county of conflict. They're starting to develop. You're starting to get, you know, land parcels, but it's subsistence farming by and large. There's only a few of that kind of plantation complex system set up. They are in the Gloucester area, which would be kind of from Lilburn through Snellville, that corner of the county. That's where the land starts to flatten out enough to be able to be used in big time cotton production, because that's the reason that slave labor was needed, was to handle huge fields. In the, you know, rest of the county, there was very little slave ownership. It was, if it was there, it was generally one or two. In most cases, it was very small, because people, again, were dealing with subsistence farming. They didn't have the monetary ability, if they even wanted to go out and purchase, in most cases, a human being. All that puts Gwinnett in a very odd spot when the secession movement starts to come about. When secession comes and is brought about, you know, with Lincoln coming to power, what has to happen is the state decides they're going to call a convention, and we're going to ask for representatives from each county to come to the state capitol in Milledgeville, and we're going to vote about whether we want to go out or whether we want to stay in. And, you know, just as any other counties, Gwinnett sends its representatives down, and those representatives are going to be probably your wealthiest, your most politically connected, right? Because that's you know, not trying to be mean, that seems to always kind of rise to the top of the political circles, is whoever's got the most money or whoever can pull the most strings. So they send down 3 representatives from Gwinnett, and they sit in the old state house at Milledgeville and listen to all these debates about why we should go, why we should stay, and that type of stuff. And when it comes time for a vote, these guys look at each other and say, this is stupid. And Gwinnett votes no. All 3 of them vote no, as far as if we should leave the county or if we should leave the union. And if you map that stuff out, what you'll see is those counties where the plantation complex is not strong wants to stay in the union. It makes no sense to leave this union. The other places where they see the chance of a monetary failure if they maintain the union is where you get the heavy secession movement. Unfortunately, that's South Georgia. So just by fact of numbers, Gwinnett, again, follows that mentality of I'm a citizen of the state and goes out with Georgia when they become part of the Confederacy. Now, what's interesting is they have the vote and they say, okay, we're going to leave. They go and have the calligrapher draw the nice big, you know, document out, lay it out in front of them, and they come back the next day to sign it. And of those 3 Gwinnett guys that voted no, one of them walks up and signs, and the other 2 refuse to sign it. They said, we're not putting our names on this. This is not something that's going to end well for us. And that's how Gwinnett feels when secession comes about. Now, again, that's how they feel. But you do what your neighbors do. You support your neighbors. So when the time comes and they're calling for troops and these things happen, Gwinnett supplies a lot of people to fight in the Confederate Army. They also supply some Union soldiers. They're, again, to talk about that Hills Mill location that was run by a family member of mine named Joshua Hill, and he had a number of sons. Joshua Hill had fought in the War of 1812, was a staunch Union man. His oldest son, Joshua Hill Jr., by 1862, left Gwinnett County, went to Knoxville, Tennessee, and enlisted in the 8th Tennessee Infantry, which was a Union regiment at the time. So he went up and joined to fight with the Federals while 2 of his other brothers fought for the South. So you do have a brother against case, and that happens several times throughout Gwinnett County because the loyalties are split in some cases within families. They see that, you know, this is a bad thing or this is a good thing or whatever it may be, but you do have that division that happens. The war happens. Gwinnett is harmed mainly in agricultural production. What happens is statistically, every home in Gwinnett is touched by the war. If you look at the number of soldiers provided or the number of, you know, goods sent, every household in Gwinnett is touched. So to talk about why a lot of the tie-in happens, well, it's because everybody has a connection to the war in some way, shape, or form. You know, it's very different when you get into New England. There's not necessarily, you know, Harvard still has a rowing team at this time. You know, in the South, colleges are shut down because there's no kids to go there. It's a population difference, so it's just a statistically stronger effect. By 64, the war is encroaching on Atlanta, and because Gwinnett is not on a preferred railroad route, there's not much happening here. We are a backwater. So they're sucking all the resources out that they can as far as grain. And there was actually a hat factory up near the Hamilton Mill exit of 85 that made hats for the Confederate Army. But those type of things are going out of the county. But there's no reason for federal troops to come here because there's nothing to be had by possessing the county as a military strategic objective. What does happen is just before the battles for Atlanta, Sherman allows a cavalry raid to skirt around and go out the Georgia Railroad, which would have gone out near Conyers in that area. And on their loop back in toward Decatur, which would have been just as big as Atlanta at the time as far as political and people and power goes, one of the groups under a Union commander named Minty moves up and actually takes a turn to come up toward Tripp, Georgia, which is current day Grayson. When they get into Grayson, they burn about 200 bales of cotton. They start taking slaves with them as they're moving through. one guy gets out of town in a buggy and flies up the road to Lawrenceville, warns them that the Yankees are coming. So all the natives start hiding their cotton and their corn and anything they can move off down into the swamps and woodlands. And Minty records in his diary that, yeah, that guy got out of town ahead of us and we couldn't find anything on the way to Lawrenceville. What is interesting is in his diary, he said, my troops behaved the best they've ever behaved when we got to Lawrenceville. He said it had been pretty wild and rambunctious for the entire trip, but for whatever reason, they calmed down by the time we got to Lawrenceville. And we didn't have any problems with the local populace. They were kind to us. We were kind to them. We didn't have anything to take, so we didn't take anything. But as they approach, these 600 or so odd, freshly supplied, nicely mounted Union cavalrymen are met by what is the Invalid Corps. So being that it's 1864, a number of Confederates that had been wounded are essentially sent home to recover. And when that guy in the buggy rides into town and says the Yankees are coming, they go around and start knocking on all these invalids' doors. So you can see guys, dragging their legs or an arm doesn't work, and they all stack them up near where McConnell Middle School is. And they do the honorable thing. They get off one round of shots, and they kind of all stick their hands up in the air like, please don't kill us. And they pretty much say, go back home and don't fight anymore. And so that's the stirring skirmish that happened in Gwinnett County in '64. The sad part that comes out of this raid is as they're camped on the Yellow River, these federal troops, more and more slaves begin to congregate and come to them. And the next day, they move back to Decatur and back to the outskirts of the siege lines around Atlanta. And they've now gathered several hundred slaves. And, these are slaves that are supposed to be freed because they existed in the South after the Emancipation Proclamation. They get to the 14th Army Corps, and the chief engineer says, nope, they're going to dig our ditches. And so they go from one set of forced labor to another set of forced labor. It's a sad and a terrible and a horrible thing. There's no wonder that there's animosity that exists there, because there was a promise and the promise was not kept. So that is what it is. Come 1865, the war is coming to its conclusion. There was an old story passed in my family that Nathaniel Bailey's home was raided by Union cavalrymen at the end of the war in '65, and they gave them boiled peanuts to eat because that's the only thing they had. And then they got dysentery because if you're not used to having boiled peanuts as kind of a key part of your diet, it does some numbers on your system, and nonetheless. And so Eli shook his head and says, okay, that's a cute little story. There was no Union cavalry here in 1865. It doesn't match any records. And as always, the National Archive proved me wrong this time, because one of the guys that was with that cavalry troop came out of Athens and made maps as they traveled in an old captured notebook, how many miles they traveled each day and where they were at. So what was happening was the Union cavalry was trying to block off all the crossings of the Chattahoochee River before Jefferson Davis could get west. And this particular group of cavalry came out of Athens, went to a place called Auburn, Georgia, and moved along, crossed over the Berry Branch and Appalachia River to the Hill Homestead, and this is where the peanut incident happened. So I had to kind of go back and say, yes, on the 11th of May, 1865, they may indeed have gotten some bad peanuts there. The idea is kind of backed up by the fact that the commanding general of these troops, as he sent them out from Athens, gave orders to all his divisions that as you travel, make sure you carry 3 to 4 day rations, because the countryside has been famished by war and there's no food to be had between here and Atlanta. And so it was definitely a poor thing. So 1865, the cavalry moves along. They come by a number of these places. There's the Alcovy. They come into Lawrenceville. They come across by Wilson's Mill. And then going out the other side, if you live out Lawrenceville Swanee Road, that's the route they took to get over to Horrell's Ferry on the Chattahoochee and block that off so that Jefferson Davis couldn't escape that way. Of interesting note, There was a little line that they crossed here called Hornell's Depot, which was just a big barn. It says to Atlanta and to Hog Mountain. This is Peachtree Road. This is the Peachtree Ridge where the Eastern Continental Divide is at. So again, it plays into kind of who everybody is and what's going on at that time. Let's see, stop share. Forgive me, I'm learning to navigate this thing. I will get it. All right. I see we're about halfway through. Any burning questions? Everybody still good? You like you tease me every time, Russell.
Yeah, question here. So in terms of Sherman's March, did they go through Lawrenceville for Sherman's March? Or, because I know like in Savannah that was a big thing, but I'm not sure if Lawrenceville would happen.
Yeah, so they wouldn't have come through Lawrenceville on Sherman's March. It was just those cavalry raids that scoured the countryside around. Gwinnett's not on any sort of major thoroughfare as far as getting to the coast. So it wouldn't have made sense to send anybody this way. So those two cavalry occupations would have been the only thing you would have seen until Reconstruction when U.S. troops were stationed here.
Cool.
A good question.
Thanks.
Anybody else got anything before I keep moving along? Any snores? Everybody good? All right. So what I'll say is one of the books that I would recommend, especially in the light of current events, is one by a legendary Yale historian named C. Van Woodward. And the book is called The Strange Career of Jim Crow. He wrote it first in the 50s and then actually did a couple of revisions as the civil rights movement happened. The cover of the third edition features a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. That references his review of the book, and King calls the book the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. And what C. Van Woodward points out is that in the South, integration was a part of daily life until Reconstruction got a hold of everything. Now, don't misread that and think equality was there. Equality was not there, but integration was. And what he says is Reconstruction has its failure when the populist movement gets defeated in the South, kind of coming after that, after the war. So you're trying to move toward a hard federal swing, and it's kind of a reverse of a pendulum going back and forth, that there's this heavy Reconstruction hand and it swings back the other way. But if you want to feel kind of, you know, what the different pieces were of the South and how a lot of that conflict starts happening after the Civil War, that book is one of the biggest ones I think you can read. He does a number of writings on those. But as we move into Reconstruction in Gwinnett County, the residents of the county, you know, C. Van points out that there is a very specific line you've got to draw between Confederates and Redeemers. There were those people that were part of the community and went off and fought the war. And then there are those who moved in the political spectrum after the war and Reconstruction that swung the South back to a heavily Democratic base. And he's saying, yeah, there is some people that were in both sides, but distinctly those are kind of two different groups. And that too often times now they get merged together when they're definitely two very different groups. And you have, again, Gwinnett at a center of conflict, but at a unique center of merging in Reconstruction, because what happens is the Freedmen's Bureau moves in and says, all right, we've got to, you know, take care of things. One of the worst things that could have happened at the conclusion of the war was the assassination of Lincoln. If you haven't, Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, is absolutely outstanding in explaining and showing how Lincoln was able to keep an extremely diverse and very thought diverse team together to get to political ends he wanted. And that's where the nation stood in '65. When Lincoln was assassinated, that destroyed any hope for Reconstruction having any sort of smoothness. And, you know, I'm not a Lincoln fan in full disclosure, but he was the guy that could have pulled it off. The presidency falls to Johnson. Johnson tries to go with Lincoln's plan. He takes some of the stuff out, but he is unable to control the radical Republicans in Congress. So that first move of Reconstruction is, okay, once 10% of the people say they're loyal and you pass the 13th Amendment and write a new state constitution that says no slavery and, you know, conforms to some other things, you can come back in as a full state. So Georgia does that. They meet in December of 65. They check the boxes. They send it off. They get their new elections and they send their people off to Congress and to the State House. And the radical Republicans refuse to seat them. They say, oh, no, that's not going to go. Those are former Confederates. They can't be in here. We're not going to allow it. We're going to pass our own Reconstruction laws. And this starts this back and forth that happens between Johnson and the radical Republicans, where one side wants this, another side wants that. What happens on a local level is you have constant enfranchisement and disenfranchisement. So you've got people who 1 week can vote because they passed the new state Constitution, they passed the 13th Amendment, and the next week they can't vote because they fought in the Confederate Army. And then the next week they can vote because they signed an oath, and then the week after that they can't vote because they haven't said the ironclad vote. Now that's a bit of a simplification because we're working with some time, but that's what your local populace would have felt at the time. Now, one of the things Gwinnett does right during this initial period is the Freedmen's Bureau is created, which is supposed to assist freed African Americans in making this transition. You know, the Freedmen's Bank is formed. They're supposed to help them with land ownership and things like that, and to make sure that their rights are taken care of. A couple of those guys that went down and voted against secession are still active in the political spectrum. They lobby the U.S. government and say, hey, we've got a guy here who would be a good agent for the Freedmen's Bureau. He's a former Confederate officer, first lieutenant. He resigned because he needed to come home and help. So you can see the eyebrow raising that's already going on, right? A former Confederate run the Freedmen's Bureau, that's not going to happen. Well, they go ahead and appoint him. It's okay, well, he can do it. And by and large, he actually does a stellar job. When the 1868 election comes around, the Republican vote in Gwinnett County is about 30%, which would equate to the percentage of the county population that was African American. So it looks like this, you know, Claiborne was his name, that he actually acted in good faith and tried to give accurate political representation to everybody in the county. Now, one of the challenges was he had to resign because he couldn't make ends meet. He couldn't make enough money to continue in that role. He was then replaced by an out-of-towner, and the out-of-towner came in, and instead of, you know, and we don't know what those face-to-face conversations were. But if you're somebody in a community and you can go have a one-on-one conversation with somebody, or you've known somebody's family for a while, you can be much more convicting and move someone's heart a lot quicker than you can if you're new to the community and you show up with 20 uniformed federal troops behind you. So all of a sudden the tension swings heavily the other way. The Republican percentage in vote goes way down, and it's generally, looking at most of the evidence, that everybody says it's a 70% white county. It wouldn't matter if every black vote went for the Republicans. We're never going to win anything, so why bother? Coming out of that, the support then moves back to the individual communities. So if they're not able to get support from this out-of-towner and this Freedmen's Bureau and soldiers with guns, the African-American community starts to support itself. One of the ways they do that, see if I can figure out how to do this again, sorry. Share screen and go here, is by working with in themselves. This is a picture of Bob Craig and Laura Freeman Goldston. These were two natives to the area, former slaves, and they saw how if they worked together, things could get better, how they could support each other. These two went to one of the local lawyers who had been one of those people that thought, secession was not a good thing and said, here's what we're trying to do. Will you help us? And he goes before the court and gets them a license to open the Loving Aid Society. And what the Loving Aid Society do is designed to assist the African American community. And they start getting a number of lodges all across the South. The groups band together and work so that they can support themselves or in their community. So coming out of this terrible devastation it is the war and the ills of Reconstruction, we start to see communities coalesce around each other. Somebody I'll mention in a minute is this individual kind of right here. His name is Ezra Charles. And there he is participating in one of the lodge parades for the Loving Aid Society, where the community is helping each other to defer different costs and support each other. This particular location is just about 5 blocks from our church on Pike Street. That's where this land and this Loving Aid Society lodge would have been stationed. So it gives you a little bit of a picture of something that was nearby and how people started to help each other. What happens is we start to see that community coalescing with the Loving Aid Society. We see everybody coming back together. We didn't have the big, there was the big plantation complexes, a few of them on the south end of the county, but by and large, there weren't a bunch of them. What you had was the subsistence farming. There was a commission formed in New York in 1867 called the Southern Famine Commission, because not only was the South depleted of grain and food for a number of years, there was immediately droughts following the Civil War in this period of Reconstruction, and people were starving to death. It was not the rich that were affected. It was not the legislators who were affected. It was the poor people, and that went across all colors. Gwinnett County was no different. The bulk of what you saw here was poor people, black, white. It didn't matter. The land, because there weren't hard specie payments available to pay for taxes, starting getting repossessed, bought by out-of-towners. And during this time period, moving through there up through what's called the Gilded Age, Gwinnett County turns into a sharecropper society. This is where, another one of my kind of family story starts to come in. My paternal grandfather, Sammy Stancel, he grew up sharecropping. When I had to do a story one time, and I think it was in high school or something like that, about the Great Depression, we're supposed to interview our grandparents. And so I go to talk to him because they've been cotton farmers, in Gwinnett County growing up. I asked him about it. He said, depression. We didn't know there was a depression on. We never had anything. He was born in 1917. So the South was raggedly poor. Gwinnett County was no exception to that. There was nothing industry-wise that was going to happen outside of a couple of unique cases. And by and large, the bulk of the population would have to go at the beginning of the year, buy their seed on credit, go out and farm a particular piece of land, hope that they made enough cotton or whatever to sell at the end of the year to pay back off the seed, and then 2/3 of those proceeds or half those proceeds would go to the landowner. And then hope what was left over would take care of their families. So by and large, that's what's going on in this county for the next 30 years as Reconstruction is playing out. Nobody has anything. It's very poor. The things that do happen in a positive manner to move the county towards some economic advantages. First is the railroads. The railroads had traditionally followed the routes of rivers and roads. So everything was kind of coming up following the rivers. That's the reason Atlanta was a key spot. It was kind of on the north-south, following the Chattahoochee up and then going north. They had tried to cut a railroad through Gwinnett for a couple of years. It just wasn't happening. It didn't happen until the 1870s. So late 1870s, they start laying it out, and they finally put a railroad through Beaufort. And so you've got Beaufort, Sugar Hill, and then Swanee, Swanee, I told you, was originally down the Chattahoochee River. Everybody picks up and moves the town up the hill to be on the railroad line. So they sort of abandon the old town site and move it up to where it is currently so that they can be where the railroad is. They keep going on through all this barren open pasture, and they essentially put a station out in the middle of nowhere in a couple of places. And they named one of them Duluth because the guy had been in Duluth, Minnesota, and they did another one Norcross because the guy had been in a city called Norcross. Those were essentially just a station stop on that railroad, and plowed their way down into Atlanta. Coming after that, a few years later is when the railroad comes from Auburn through Decula into Lawrenceville, makes its way down that direction, out through Lilburn and down into Decatur. Once the railroads come through, they're trying to connect the major cities. It's not that Gwinnett has this great resource they can use, it just happens to be in the path. But the fact it's in the path means that stuff's going to start congregating there. If there's a depot there, somebody's going to catch a train there. If somebody's going to catch a train there, somebody's going to want to eat. So you start seeing cottage industries build up around these towns. And that's when Gwinnett's towns actually start to grow and become who they are, is based on this railroad development. There aren't many unique labor laws like they have in the industry at the time. So you didn't hire a whole bunch of locals except for track laborers. And those were generally very low skilled positions. In some cases, you could make more on some farms. Some cases you could make more on the railroad. There's an interesting story out of this. A guy named Thomas Lively. He was the son of a slave that was on a plantation in South Gwinnett County. He took a job with one of these railroads as a track laborer. And so he showed up every day and drove some spikes and tightened nuts and bolts. And Thomas saved his money and was very wise with what he did, using some of the tools that had been taught to him by the Freedmen's Bureau. He then goes back to the land where his father and grandfather had been slaves and purchases it. He's able to purchase the old plantation house, and initially about 50 acres. He keeps working and keeps saving, and eventually gathers about 250 acres of the original land. And so he goes within a couple of generations from being slaves in South Gwinnett County to being a large landowner at a time when a number of people can't even own land because they don't have the financial means to do so. One of the good stories about that is his family they sort of renamed the plantation. It was originally built by a guy named McGuire from Ireland. They renamed the house and the land the Promised Land. And about 3 years ago, they gave the Promised Land over to Gwinnett County to be used as a park. So they're currently kind of peeling back the layers of that house that's had vinyl and aluminum siding, getting back to the original plantation home and everything that was underneath it. So if you get down that in Gwinnett County and you want to just poke around and see, Google the Promised Land. And you'll be able to go down that road. You'll recognize the name McGuire. You'll be able to see that place that somebody saved their money and went back and sort of redeemed their own story in a unique place there on the other end of the county. Let's see here. It's about this time too that Gwinnett first starts seeing people move in from out of the county for any sort of reason. It's traditionally been, if you're here, you're here. But now at this time, you're starting to get people that are moving in because of railroads or because there's land opportunities and things like that. 1929, my grandfather talks about when he was little, watching a giant steam shovel grade US 29 and pave it. And he recalls as a boy how that happened and what it looked like, and that changed the fabric of life. It began, now the railroads had changed it, now the paving of streets was going to change it. He told me when you were a kid, it was an all-day journey if you lived in the Harbins area to be able to get over to Decula. You would spend your morning getting to Decula, do your business, and then spend the afternoon getting back home because of the roughness of the roads or whatever you're hauling in your wagon. By the time they paved the roads, he told me people could easily get to those big cities like Lawrenceville and back in less than a day. So all of a sudden it changed the dynamic, how people are going to interact. His grandfather had been one of those few people that had been successful. And he had, he was a very stingy and mean man from all accounts, but he was one of those people that, you know, would buy something and then immediately turn around and try to sell it. If he could make $1 off selling his mother up the river, he probably would have done it. But by and large, he ended up controlling most of eastern Gwinnett County. If you've heard of Tribble Mill or Freeman's Mill, he owned those mills and all the land around them. He owned a couple of ponds in those areas, and was able to send his sons to school. Of my 4 grandparents, that the one that I'm speaking of, he was the one that was kind of raised middle class Gwinnett. Everybody else were sharecropping families, and he was the one that had a little bit unique, different experience, kind of exposures within a town. As that paving happened, that's when you start getting a lot of road names. Before then, you just kind of had a road that went between Lawrenceville and Decula. That's when it became US 29 because the US helped pay for the pavement. The roads that came off of them would go back to settlements, and they would often be referred to as a settlement road that led over to Callie Still's place. Eventually, the road would just become known as Callie Still Road, or if you're familiar with Old Fountain Road, well, that was the road that led to James Fountain's home place, or the Old Fountain home place, and eventually just became the Old Fountain Road. I grew up on Stancel Drive. That should tell you something about who used to live there. But that's when the county starts to reconstruct and kind of really become shaped in more of a modern way. The county still, to an extent, remains fairly poor and largely agricultural, although there's these advantages. Some business, by and large, the county's agricultural, and they're kind of making it year to year. The war years, the Depression really doesn't have a major effect on the county because there's not that much money here anyway. It continues to be just a poor, desperate place. My great uncle William used to talk about, he was part of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And I asked, what'd y'all do? What projects? He's like, oh, they sent us down to Jackson, Georgia, and we played baseball all day, and they sent half our money back to our parents. So it's kind of worried about the federal programs at that point, but that's what he did. The communities, again, were very strong. School was valued, and it's the first time that we start seeing teams develop. It's kind of coming out of the 1930s and 40s. They'll start organizing baseball. Eventually, this sport called basketball makes it, and the county starts playing a county tournament every year where the high schools play each other. Decula was a legendary basketball school for many years. In 1937, they made it to the state title game. They had to go and borrow Lawrenceville High School's basketball because their basketball was too worn out. The laces were showing through, and so they had to go borrow a neighboring school's basketball. JT Bradbury, a man I knew growing up, missed the last shot and they lost by 1 point. And I heard my dad ask him, JT, you ever think about that? He says, I see that shot every day. They made it back the next year and they won, and they gave them this big letter D, state champ, belt buckle. That was their prize for winning the state basketball tournament in 1938, Decula. They told all the boys that was solid gold. I can assure you it is not. No. But I had my granduncle William and my grandfather both played on that team. And then immediately after World War II breaks out and they go off to war. That war really shapes this county, not in the fact that it punches a bunch of stuff in here, but that people see the outside world. We start seeing a lot of people move, change what they're doing, how they're doing things. Major influx in and out of Atlanta. Familiar with Eisenhower. He has a terrible experience during World War I with trying to move a troop train across the country, and so he develops the interstate system. And in 1950s, they carve I-85 through Gwinnett County. Now these people that have traditionally been very local or moved to and from Lawrenceville, to and from Beaufort to work, are now getting on the interstate and commuting into Atlanta to work. Or as people move in from out of state, they look at Gwinnett as a possible living option rather than having to live in the city, because there's a way to get in or out. The commuter trains help that initially with passenger trains, and then it becomes something that happens as a result of the building of the interstates. So let me show you one little quick thing I threw together. This is the population of the United States looking from 1820 up to 2010. Pretty steady graph going up. Here's the population of Gwinnett County across that same period. It's not until we get to about 1950 that we start seeing a steep increase. So it's really not until those transportation modes are there to convey people out of the county for work that we begin to see the huge growth and influx of the county. That's when we start to see the change in diversity between just African American and white to what happens is the Asian population begins to grow in the Chamblee area based on some other factors that happen in DeKalb County right there, and that growth comes up Buford Highway and then moves across and in. And then likewise, you start to see a Latino increase as it comes out of the poultry processing plants in Gainesville, where a lot of that work is done, and people start moving down into Gwinnett County from that side. And that's what begins to grow the diversity of the county over the past 20 years. That changes to make it a, what do they call a majority minority type county rather than a solid white type county. Those are the effects and things that happen there. Let's see, there's a couple of things. There are just a few little items that I think, and it's 3:30, I want to show you a couple of pictures, talk about a couple of things, and then leave it wide open if you got some questions. And if you don't, then I'll, fill up the rest of your time with all sorts of craziness. But there were a couple of industries that were in Gwinnett that were rather substantial and key and employed a number of people. That same Union cavalry officer that rode through Lawrenceville talked about that when they came through town, there was nothing to burn because the thread mill had burned down just a few weeks before. It was then rebuilt, and eventually, once it was rebuilt, stayed in the county until about 1980. And that would have been, let's see, trying to find this thing, Freedom's Bank Perimeter. I thought I had that thing, here we go, let's see, Lawrenceville area looking east. Overhead of Lawrenceville, 1955. Right in the center, and I know it's fuzzy because it's an aerial picture somebody took from a plane. There's your courthouse. Here's the thread mill, way back over here in the top corner that became Jensco Shoe. New City Church would have sat just across the street from that. This is where New City is at, is right across from the thread mill at the time. So you can think about as you've driven through Lawrenceville and out into the countryside, it doesn't quite look like this. And here we are, and this is 1955, not all that long ago, and you see how still agricultural it is just outside the county. If you know where the Dairy Queen is, the Dairy Queen will be right here, and just beyond that, nothing but agricultural land. So that was one of the big things that happened. The other thing was, oh, there it is, Jensco factory. Let me see if I can flip that for you. All right. New City Church would sit just beyond the tip of the airplane. This is the road that brings us in and out, and the church property is right here. This is where the thread mill was that got rebuilt, but eventually became General Shoe Company, and it employed a lot of people around the Lawrenceville area for many years. This was, it actually went out of business around Depression time. It sat idle for a few years, and Jensco came in and got it for a song and a dime, and they built shoes there for a very long time. So that was one of the industries that existed in the area until it eventually closed and was torn down. This is now the lumber yard, of course, across the way. The other, and probably the biggest, was Bona Allen in Buford. And I thought I had a picture saved, but let's just do this because it'll be a lot easier. In Buford, Georgia, originally started in Lawrenceville was a guy named Bona Allen, and he moved here to be on the railroad and built a leather industry. And you can read and look at it, but I'll just show you with a real quick Google search how much you can learn. Bona Allen was fascinated with baseball. And so he took his leather industry from Lawrenceville, moved it to be on Main Street in Beaufort. It became so popular that he made horse saddles, horse collars, shoes, and everything else. During the war, he had a huge production for government shoes, and then continued after the war. He was fascinated with baseball so much that if he found a good baseball player, he would pay him to come work an easy job at the factory and to play baseball at night. And in the 30s, I want to say it was 37, they won this title, which was the Minor League World Championship. They had one of the first lighted ballparks in the Southeast. Now, this is Gwinnett County in Depression era 30s, and someone's using their leather fortune to light up a baseball park because they like it. These players were all guys that maybe were pretty close, but not good enough for the majors. They didn't want to make minor league money, so they came and worked a good factory job, or an easy factory job. And then the deal was Bona Allen and his sons got to keep the trophies, and they got to keep any money they made playing championship games. So you can go up there. They have a few of those trophies and stuff still laying around. In the sign that we destroy anything that is of value, I remember the lights and the stand still being up about 5 years ago, and the city of Beaufort was able to bulldoze those down and put up a nice playground and gym. So we don't have to worry about seeing those ugly old things anymore. Other than that, a lot of stuff out there. I've left out a number of things. Hopefully that gave you kind of a picture of who the county was, some different things to look at. One kind of final story before I throw it out there. In 1952, the state decided that they could, and this was a sort of a backdoor deal at the state legislature, they could do some finagling with some taxing for the schools, and encouraged every county to consolidate their schools in order to do some, like I said, some shady tax stuff. And Gwinnett made this big push that, okay, we will do that. We'll follow through. And they were going to combine all the schools together. Again, you know, I've got to brag on my hometown. Decula was the school that refused to go along with it and took it all the way to the state Supreme Court and won, and was able to keep their independent high school by themselves. And it was the local school board. Before these, you know, you had this giant city or giant county school board. You actually had local school boards that governed each county or each city. And so they held that out. When they did start merging, a couple of schools made recommendations or said, we're only going to merge if you do certain things. And you can see the physical evidence of that if you drive by Central Gwinnett High School. So the original Lawrenceville High School sat just behind New City Church. If you go back up, you'll see there's a tall hill. Now they're building a bunch of apartment homes up there on top of the hill, just up a block from the courthouse. That was Lawrenceville High School. And the county said, no, we're going to merge Lawrenceville and a number of other schools together, these small little schools, and make it Central Gwinnett High School. And Lawrenceville said, we'll only go if you'll keep our name in the title. And so if you drive by Lawrenceville High School or Central Gwinnett today, you'll notice it says Lawrenceville - Central Gwinnett High School, because that was one of the agreements they had to make to be able to merge those schools together. There's a number of little stories like that. I see there's a couple of chats. Let me just make sure I've addressed everything. So I'll shut up for a moment since we've got about 20 minutes left. Any particular topic or something you'd like me to touch on that I didn't say something about, or you want to call me a liar, I'm fine with any of those. Go ahead, Eric. I see your hand up. Is that right?
Yeah, I thanks so much first, Eli, for doing this. I've really enjoyed hearing you tell us about the history of the county. I wanted to just see if maybe in the future we could take and do some more of this. I know there's a lot of, actually, I think there's a lot of history here in the county, maybe not things that are, you know, known worldwide, but I just really enjoy local history. A couple of things we haven't mentioned yet, though, is it's something more recent, is the Larry Flint shooting in Lawrenceville. Larry Flint, when he was the owner and publisher of
Hustler.
Hustler magazine, yeah, was shot, and I think he was paralyzed as a result of that shooting.
Correct.
Just out, I think off Perry Street in downtown Lawrenceville. I forgot the year, but that was late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, 1978 in the 100 block of Perry Street. He was shot by a white supremacist.
John Paul Franklin.
Yep,
I remember that.
who was a mass shooter, essentially, or a serial murderer, I should say, not a mass shooter. I think he was eventually captured in Oklahoma or Missouri, where he committed a similar crime out there. But yeah, so that brought a bunch of attention to Gwinnett, and of course, Larry Flint was here defending himself in a case involving, censorship and expression of free speech and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that was at a time before we had the Gwinnett Justice and Administration Building, so it really did have a small town look to it then.
Correct.
One of the other things, I guess I kind of date myself as a child, but I still remember the Barbara Jane Mackle case. Barbara Jane Mackle was a woman who was kidnapped out of Decatur, Georgia, but was buried alive for 83 hours in a coffin-like box I think she was found in Berkeley Lake, is where because her was so influential with President Nixon, he had brought scores of FBI agents into both DeKalb and Gwinnett County, and they were able to locate her and dig her out from that horrible experience. But that was a great trial, and Gwinnett was tied into that too. But and one other thing, and then I'll just shut up, but I just wanted to also mention, since this is related to New City Church and we're talking about history, I would just recommend a book that people might find interesting, which is called The Dwelling Place. Are you familiar with it, Eli? I don't know.
It doesn't ring a bell. That doesn't mean anything.
It's written by the author's name is Erskine Clark, and it's about the southern plantations along the Georgia coast at the time when there was also a great missionary movement and a Calvinist movement, and how they dealt with slavery as a sin in the, I guess really in the creation of Columbia Theological Seminary, first in Columbia, South Carolina, and then as it moved to Decatur. But it's a fascinating book, and one that talks a lot about how there was an awful lot of internal conflict about slavery and our faith back in that time, and how the economics of slavery and the sin of slavery were both difficult issues for many people to deal with. So it reads like a novel. It's an excellent book. So again, it's called The Dwelling Place, and it's on Amazon.
Thank you for showing those. I may take a look at that. One of the, you reminded me of another item I might recommend if somebody, it's pretty light reading. You actually find it on the internet for free. Amos Hadaway was a minister that was actually the son and son-in-law of two Revolutionary War veterans, and had some sort of physical handicap, was unable to do other work, and took up the ministry as a result. And he actually helped found Hog Mountain Baptist Church and lived until like 1883. But he writes his recollections of his early years and then moving into Gwinnett and helping to found that church, and a couple of his first sermons as well in there. So if you're looking for a little bit of local flavor, and fair warning, he's not a great writer. It's very short. I hope his sermons were much better than is crafted in there. You did mention a couple of criminal cases, and I think I'll stick a couple more in there where you're thinking about it. Another one that strikes really close to home was the Mela Farr case. That was my mom's first cousin. There was a Belk in Lawrenceville, near where Arby's is, just up the road from New City. She was working there, was kidnapped, raped, and murdered. And the guy was later found, but that touched at a time in the early 70s that, when we're just starting that population curve, when my mom, a lot of people thought it was my mom. And so she remembers the phone ringing at the house throughout the night as people were calling to console my grandfather on the loss of his daughter. So that was a very tight one. There was actually, to go back a little bit further, in 1927, there's a huge distrust for banks because there's this boom and bust cycle. And there was a farmer in the Harbins community, Benefield, who just essentially saved his money every time, or saved his hard cash every time he sold cotton, and hid it under a floorboard. And some local guys kind of got rumor of it. And you could, if you want to look up the newspaper pieces, you can, but it was there was an axe, a hammer involved, and both he and his son were killed. And the house just remained vacant after that for many years. The guy they were all locals to the area that robbed him and took the money. And two of them confessed. One of them said, I didn't do it. They convicted him, and he was electrocuted in Milledgeville, brought back to Ebenezer Church in the Harbins area. And my grandfather remembers going to the funeral, and he said you couldn't see anything except people all the way around. And it took a couple of hours to people to walk by the coffin, not because they had this great reverence. They'd never seen anybody electrocuted before. And they were wondering if they were going to, what that would look like. So they had people from out of town and everywhere. He said there were cars lining the roads, wagons everywhere. They had to go, because that's how that's how out in the woods we were at this time. And, it's 1928, 29. That's, it's a very macabre scene. There's a similar type murder thing that happens. And when the guy gets buried at Appalachia Church, which is on the border of Gwinnett and Barrow, a same huge crowd, and some entrepreneurs set up around the edge of the crowd selling lemonade and whiskey because it's hot and they think that's how they're going to make a few bucks. I mean, that's, that's what happens, so plenty of those things. But
well, you mentioned there for a moment, some people that, of course, that are buried here. One of the we have some Revolutionary War soldiers buried in Lawrenceville, do we not?
We do. You've got one that is in the old cemetery, and then also probably the more unique one is where Pleasant Hill Road, south of 85. It comes down Sweetwater Memorial Chapel. If you've ever seen that old wood structure there, that is probably the most interesting cemetery in Gwinnett if you think about it as a historical whole. The reason why is, again, you think about the expansion. That end of Gwinnett doesn't get populated until after the 1820s. And so you only have a short time frame when Revolutionary War folks and things like that move in there. And we've just kicked the Native Americans off. That cemetery not only has veterans from a number of recent wars, but it's got Revolutionary War soldiers. It has Native Americans. It has free and enslaved African Americans buried there. So you can walk through that cemetery and Google it's at Sweetwater. I think it's called Memorial Chapel now because the congregation kind of went defunct, but it's kind of held as a wedding venue. The chapel is very pretty, but I believe it's off Pleasant Hill Road. So that's a very, very interesting one. So I saw the question, how did Gwinnett County schools become so large and influential? A lot of it deals with the fact that we only have Beaufort City as kind of the sole city school that's around. The rest of the county is part of the county system. Now, of course, we've got GAC, you have those Providence, those smaller Christian schools that sit out there. But by and large, the entire county is encompassed with the Gwinnett County system. And being a very large county, that's how that happens. When you look toward comparing us again to our sisters there in Atlanta, you've got Atlanta City Schools, and then you've got Decatur, which sits outside of there, which is a city school. And then you have, some different county things. So even though there may be bigger populations down there, they get split up between city, county. Or if you move into some of those places where we have similar population numbers in the outlying suburban areas, you see there's some more city schools that stand up. Carrollton's one that comes to mind. If Carroll County was unified, they'd probably be a lot bigger, but you've got Carrollton as a city school, and then you've got the county outside of that. And so there's the fact that we only have Beaufort City as a standalone school is one of them. Something I might mention, just I thought about it briefly. When Gwinnett County did have all their schools, there were several schools built for African Americans coming out of Reconstruction. Those numbers were reduced once Reconstruction kind of got toward its end. But when we started trying to unify schools, one of the things county did was create a African American high school in Lawrenceville. And if any of you have been around, ever heard of the Hooper Dome? That was the old Hooper High School gym. And Fenwick Hooper was the name of it. And then they had a couple of elementary schools. They only tore that gym down a few years ago, and it was behind where the police department is. Now they've put all this nice stuff in there, and, you know, Lawrenceville great and growing. But if you go back and look at the long newspaper interviews, or you look at some of the videos, a number of former students that went there were a little bit upset with with how they treated the remnants of that school, because they were very connected to that school as part of their story, and they weren't very pleased. Some of them were very happy, don't get me wrong, but some of them were not very pleased that kind of the last vestige of their school is going to be replaced with an apartment complex. And, you know, Buford also had the same thing. They had an African American and a white high school, and they merged when my father was in high school. And again, I think it was a high school or college project. I interviewed him, my dad, and one of his best friends, a black guy named Eddie Ingram. And so we know a lot of the stories that are taught. And I interviewed them separately, and, you know, to put together for this paper. And I was really amazed at the story that came back. It was not a story of as much conflict as, again, when you get to the person in person, it was, I always knew Eddie. I always knew Wayne. We always played ball together. I don't know why we went to school different places, but we always played ball together. And then they ended up playing ball together and graduating. And so it's, you know, I'm not trying to paint all politicians or all upper echelon as bad in any shape or form. But when you try to craft broad, overreaching policy, that can have a terrible negative effect on the individual. And those individuals who may be just like this, you know, can be pulled apart by a bad policy and be painted in bad lights, you know, by a bad policy. So it's something to keep in mind. Other questions?
Can I name one other person that's buried in Gwinnett, just because?
No, go ahead.
It's going to sound a little silly, but I'm a big fan of Louis Grizzard.
Oh, yeah.
And Louis's father is buried in Snellville. But if you ever get a chance to read a good book, it's called My Father Was a Pistol and I'm a Son of a Gun. And it's one of his many humorous books that he'd written in the past, but it's a very touching one too to read if you ever get a chance to want to read a touching memoir about him and his dad.
For anybody not familiar, Grizzard was a very famous kind of Southern column writer, and perhaps one of his greatest lines was he would write a column every Sunday kind of summarizing the Georgia game. He was a diehard Georgia Bulldog, I mean, through and through. And I think it was after Auburn, and you know, he usually had at least an entire column, if not a column and a half, describing the game and the scene. And it was after one of these really, you know, upsetting late game losses, and his only sentence in his column, and the rest of it was blank space, was "I don't want to talk about it." And it summed him up perfectly, because he knew kind of what to say and how to read the lines, and a beautiful, beautiful writer.
He was also funny in the sense that he wasn't, you know, I don't think he was a very strong believer, but he used to talk about when he died, he wanted to go to Vince Dooley's house.
Very true, very true. Okay, I will shut up. Anything else you want me to cover, Nathan? Anything I've spoken wildly about or I need to be brought before the session on?
No, I mean, that's why we have Brandon here, just in case anything like that happened. But no, thank you so much. I think everybody agrees with me on just like, we appreciate the time you took and the attention to detail that you paid. And it really is very exciting for all of us, I think, to be able to, as you were talking about community and talking about neighbors, I mean, there is something about being able to grasp a little better hold of your roots and be able to know where you come from. And I think, like, as an application, as you were trying to get to us, looking at the conflict of Gwinnett, but also knowing that like a lot of that conflict came from a good reason. As far as just like dealing with the missionary or talking about people who are not wanting to get involved in the Civil War in one way or another. I think there's nothing wrong, and once again, just recognizing conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, and having a history of watching people trying to do the right thing, I think is a really good heritage to grab a hold of for us moving forward. Joe Brand just causes conflict, period. And that's why, that's why we've got here.
Your mama was conflicted.
Thanks, Joe.
Letting you live.
We're going to stop the recording now before you keep talking.